Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be looking at the legacy of J.B. Rhine, who is widely considered to be the father of modern parapsychology. My guest is his daughter, Sally Rhine Feather, born in 1930. She is currently on the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina. She is co-author with Michael Schmicker of The Gift, The Extraordinary Paranormal Experiences of Ordinary People. And she is also co-editor with Barbara Ensrud of the newly released book, J.B. Rhine, Letters, 1923 to 1939, ESP, and the Foundations of Parapsychology. Sally lives in Durham, North Carolina, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Hello, Sally. What a pleasure to be with you once again.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
We're going to be talking about the new book that you and Barbara Ensrud have edited about the letters that your father wrote, mostly before you were born, from 1923 to 1939. So when the last letter in the book was written, you were about 10 years old.
Yes. In 1940, I was 10 years old.
One might say that you were born right into the thick of the ongoing development of an infant science that we can look back now some 90 years later and say it's still going strong.
It's amazing. I'm glad I lived this long to see that it was going strong again.
I know that there were moments in the book where it wasn't clear whether parapsychology would survive as a science.
Isn't this the way of parapsychology as we've known it? There are ups and downs, and for any one person in their own life, there's sometimes downs because the experiment didn't work the way you thought it would, or your professor didn't like you doing this work in his studio or research lab. So, yeah, it's a precarious science. I don't know why we like it so much, Jeff. Here we are.
Well, I think people feel a special passion for it because, from my way of thinking, and I know it doesn't sound very scientific, studying parapsychology is a way to be closer to my own inner being.
That's a good way of putting it, yes. And after I read your story, which I had not heard before, the various things that have happened to you recently of how you came into the field, I think that's particularly true. I came in a different way, but I certainly respect and can understand fully why you are still in it and will always be in it.
Well, and I know you've taken some breaks from parapsychology yourself. You had a clinical psychology practice, but here you are, continuing the work of the Rhine Center, really the work that your father started before you were born, and your mother.
Both of them were in it completely. She was the one to have the children, as nature has allowed it to be. So during the same time when he was getting started, almost that summer was the first time that they could, as a young couple, had enough stability to begin a family. And then, wow, there were 4 of them in the same period of time that he was getting his early results. Her part was, of course, quietly in those days, not even discussed, barely mentioned in letters, which, of course, women of today would not handle it quite the same way. But it was universal. It was agreed upon for both of them. That was the way it was. And he'd come home at night and help out and so forth. And at least he was around as a father, and that was very helpful to us as children. I don't know what the children offered to him other than a slight distraction from the worries of his work, other than just what any father feels.
As I recall from the letters, your mother received her PhD in botany, and then your father received his PhD in botany after her.
Yes, that's correct. Actually, she was 4 years older than he was and had been a childhood friend, not thinking of the romance that might ensue because of the difference in their age. So, but I think that a few years older, a little more maturity, when you have children, is also a good time, so that they work together better than if they were 20-year-olds trying to make a living.
And the interesting thing to me is that after having each of them achieved degrees in botany, I think from the University of Chicago, and they were in a position to have successful scientific careers in their chosen field of study, they jointly made a decision to move out of botany into this very, very risky field that was at the time known as psychical research.
Absolutely. And those letters reflect that. What the purpose, of course, of our book was, as my forward preface said, I already knew that my dad was controversial, and a lot of people thought that, and still think, this is nothing to all this. So I wanted people to just see, in his words, not like me defending him or all, but what he said. And you're right, he started out with this strong. They both together heard Sir Arthur Conan Doyle speak, developed a common interest in psychic research. So it was a common interest from the beginning. And that made it a lot easier when he wanted to leave. She might have stayed, but he felt he just couldn't work on a botanist bench or whatever the rest of his life when he had such a strong interest for something that he thought was more significant for mankind.
Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, the author of the Sherlock Holmes novels, who was one of the most famous men in the world at that time, and a passionate spiritualist and a very articulate speaker, I'm sure, although I never had the privilege of hearing him speak.
Me too. Yes, he spoke at the University of Chicago, or else in Chicago when they went to hear him. I never did hear more about it, but that piqued their interest, and then they went back and looked into what psychic research, what the societies of psychical research in this country and overseas, and then read lots of material. Yeah.
It seemed as if the call to understand the deep philosophical and deep scientific questions that were posed by the challenge of spiritualism just seemed so much more exciting than working in a botany laboratory.
And it really tied into his wanting to have been a minister and being very devout in his teenage years, and then being disappointed that he couldn't, after he encountered scientific method in college, he felt, well, where's the evidence? I don't know. I can't see the scientific evidence that might underlie my spending my life in studying and preaching and so forth. So it was a sidetrack. If he could find, if some of the claims of psychic research were true, that would be a way that he could look at it from a scientific point of view. So it was a door to get to what I think was always a basic early life choice, and devout feeling that he was wanting to help mankind. It was a time of turmoil. Well, we know about turmoil today, but there was turmoil at the turn of that century, and after the end of the First World War, a lot of questioning and doubts and so forth, and yet also a lot of interest in survival because of so many young men who having been killed in the war.
Up until that time, for the most part, the field of psychical research was a field study science. It really didn't achieve experimental status until your father came along. I mean, there were a couple of experiments done here and there, but no serious push to establish parapsychology as a science with double blinds and statistics and the normal research protocols found in psychology.
Exactly. That was the difference, because whether some good research was done by the people overseas mainly, but it wasn't coordinated, and it wasn't in one location, particularly an academic location to start off with. And that was, he was able to do that by a series of his own hard work to begin with, and then some fortunate coincidences that Dr. McDougall at Duke University was hoping to set a psychic research department there when he moved there from Harvard. So it was a fortuitous connection there that helped at that point. Nowhere else in the world at that time was there anyone like William McDougall with his stature. Professor, he had, at that time, he was probably the most popular psychologist in Britain and maybe in this country. So that made a big difference.
And I think it's fair to say that your parents sort of struggled for several years to get their footing. There are many letters to different academics who might help support them or sponsor them so that they could make the transition. It wasn't a simple matter just to move from botany into psychical research.
There was a lot of sidetracks along the way. There was the famous within this area, small area that we're talking about, of his investigating a medium and finding her fraudulent after already almost falling in love with her beforehand, because it all seemed so, not her particularly, but the idea of her had been so positively presented to him by people in the ASPR at that time. And so he expected something really remarkable, and then he would come and learn how to study mediums, and it would go on that way. Well, that all fell apart, and even his effort to work with the fine people in the British site, there was a Boston Society for Psychical Research that was looking for other mediums. They didn't believe in Marjorie was real. Anyway, he worked for a year, and my mother both, making a living and trying to investigate other mediums. Then he even came down to Duke with a manuscript of medium mystic readings, which were quite remarkable and certainly indicated something psychic going on with a man named John Thomas, whom they helped, who later came to Duke and got his own degree at their helping him to do that. So there was a degree provided on the basis of psychic research to John Thomas, I believe a master's degree, maybe a doctorate degree, yeah. But all of that was going on, and that was part of the struggle to discover which way are we going to go. And JB said when he found that medium seemed fraudulent to him, that he would never again accept something from someone else unless he had control of the experiment, or if he knew what was going on and he was in charge, then he could rule out the possibility of cheating, because he wasn't going to cheat. And so that led him around. It took a little while, and they would venture with the horse and all that before he got involved at Duke in forced choice testing, which is what he brought to the field. It may seem dull, but it's about the only way that it could have been done at that time, particularly with behaviorism going on. Well, I'm going on, rattling on too much, and let me get back to your question.
Well, you mentioned the incident with the horse. This is a very interesting story because it appeared at first that this was a horse who had telepathic abilities, but then later on, things may have changed.
That this was Lady the horse, and they worked with her for a while, and they had McDougall coming too, and they would, I heard this story many times, and I didn't get to see Lady. She had passed away by the time I was old enough to see her. But at the very beginning, she acted differently. She was in a passive state. She didn't seem to be noticing them. They were hiding behind a wall, and got the mistress out of the way. The one who owned the horse was clearly capable and was probably giving clues. At the beginning, they thought they really did have something, but as they investigated it more and more, she either lost it or she clearly was picking up clues. So that was another example of where you don't have control of the experiment. You can't really handle it. If it had been their horse, they would have figured out a better way.
Well, I noticed throughout the entire book of letters, there is this struggle going on the one hand, to be able to convince other academics and the world at large about the validity of the experiments which JB and his staff members did have control over. And on the other hand, I think he felt a need to be critical of many claims that were being made and reported to him that didn't really pan out at all.
Yeah, they had to be. The test was a research setup, really. Even if they'd gotten into animal side, as later did, you have to be very careful and know what you're doing. But certainly with humans in the laboratory, applied testing, but that's probably true to some extent of anything in psychology. But because it's so common, people don't get so critical about, if you were doing a study and learning nonsense syllables, people wouldn't be questioning you unless you made some unusual claim. But of course, ESP itself is an unusual claim. We all know that. And if you weren't into it and watch it and seen it happen, which I have, and you have, you really, even so, you want to have good controls, no matter, even if you know it's the real thing, it's got to stand the test of other people.
I think the big landmark occurred, if I recall correctly, in 1934 with the publication of his first monograph on ESP. And at that point, he had been doing research with the cards, the ESP cards or Zener cards, for several years. And the monograph was published by the Boston Society for Psychical Research, but it almost immediately brought him international acclaim.
Amazing. It was the time of radio and the time of the press. The science press made all the difference in the world. They picked it up and reported it accurately, and then the public found out about it. So that accidentally turned again to a big surprise. It wasn't a terribly well-written book, but everything was included there. But it was his report. They have to get this out, and it was the result of a lot of people tests. It wasn't JB himself. It was soon got to be Gaither Pratt, Charlie Stewart, and a host of other graduate students. And it was a pretty impressive. You can go back and look at it today. I have a well-worn copy. It was reprinted in this 1960. And if you can make your way through it, you can see what it was, how they got these results of numerous subjects, not just one, but 6 or 7 really high-scoring subjects.
So at that point, your father was sort of thrust into the limelight from being an associate professor with a small team. He found that people all over the world were interested in communicating with him, and that he was also able to begin to attract quite a bit of financial resources to open a substantial library or laboratory at Duke University.
It's interesting in those letters, you see how this goes along. Things that happen, like the famous medium Eileen Garrett that founded the Parapsychology Foundation was asked to come down as a medium and be tested. And she did quite well herself, and also her control. She was a mental medium, and her control, Yubani, also scored well on these tests, even though later she confided that she didn't care for those damn cards, to use her expression. But she was good-natured and my father and she got along very well most of the time. So anyway, but a lot of things happened that brought publicity along, and and then attracted other people. Eileen Garrett was connected with a number of wealthy people, one in particular, Mrs. Bolton, who became JB's first large donor. And for quite a few years, she helped quite a bit. But he worked hard at it. Nothing was easy. He wrote letters. Well, you saw the letters, and you only saw a fraction of the letters because there were dozens and dozens and dozens of letters who people were interested and might give money, and many of them did give and help.
And at the same time, that he now has a rather substantial laboratory at Duke University, the whole professional psychology community was developing, I guess you'd have to say, at least in part, a hostile attitude.
That gradually did develop. At first, the four of them that were there, the first four people, were buddy, and Zener helped him design the cards, and somebody else taught him hypnosis and so forth. But his own, JB and his students got to be so popular, you can understand how it would be. And I don't think that JB was aware quite of that. He might have been a little more tactful or whatever. I don't know if there's any way you can do it when you become very popular and people are giving you money and the other people aren't. Typical psychology department doesn't get a lot of donations. But when it helped in 1935, when a mutual agreement that he would get his own suite of offices quite physically separate from the psychologist. They remained personal friends over the years. I knew them. A couple of them helped me get into graduate school by references from the same people that were his skeptics, Zener and Adams and so forth. But yeah, that's what happens in a small town in something like this sort.
I can imagine many of the other psychologists felt that parapsychology was like the tail wagging the dog.
There's not many people that have managed. It's too bad because it would have been, in many ways, it's really helpful to remain in an academic setting where you know all about that, where you can call on colleagues and so forth. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with such a hot topic like this, it's just we're not ready for that yet.
Of course, I wasn't around at the time, but I gather that it's very possibly the case that your father became the most famous professor at Duke University.
It could be. Actually, he was bringing in a lot of money. It didn't just come to him. It came through the university, and that was money for the university. And the board of directors and people like that were interested in it. So it just happened. He was very careful. I remember sort of things like you don't play. You have to be a little more circumspect in your manner if you're dealing with a topic like this. You don't on Sunday afternoon. You don't go out and play ball, maybe, or if you do, you keep it quiet. You have to be. I don't know. I just knew that we, and I imagine a preacher's kid would have had the same experience. You have to be. Not bring any more attention to the family than you've already got, any negative attention. Because those were fascinating times for me, too. I mean, sometimes it was too much, and I just wish everybody would go home and on the weekend and leave us some privacy. But on the other hand, these were happy adults coming around, talking about exciting things, and then doing it with wartime still, and there'd be some soldiers coming around, too, that my mother would be helping for some of her service work. So it was a jolly time. And I'm sure my friends, many of them were jealous of me when I would take them along to the office to participate in experiments where they wanted children's subjects occasionally. But that's just the way it was. And I was thinking as a child then, I wish I had written down notes knowing I was going to be interviewed by you now, and I could have had more details on the visitors that would come, these famous visitors from England and all the way up to, and people that you would know, like Erlander Haraldson and other more recent times that came to the lab. They didn't come out to our house as much in those days, but many of them did in order to eat my mother's supper or talk with Stanley Krippner was around a lot at one point in time.
And I know many of the most prominent people of that era were eager to talk to your father, people like the novelist Upton Sinclair, who was doing ESP experiments of his own.
Right, quite a book, that Mental Radio. I don't know if it was published before JB's work began. It's a little bit like remote viewing, isn't it? You're drawing a picture up in one room and sending it to somebody in another. Wife, she was the receiver, and she was quite good at receiving his pictures, yes, but they became quite good friends, and he had known Upton Sinclair. His father had been an admirer of him and his politics before, way back on the farm.
Another person of note who was, I think, very much influenced by your father was the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung.
Yes, by correspondence, absolutely. Yes, that was quite a famous dialogue between the two of them. He could never, it was before the wartime came, and Jung had to back off and keep quiet. I forget where he was then, but JB was trying to get him to speak up a little bit more because of his own experiences, and it would have been a big coup to do that, but he was not. Well, he was his own experiences that were interesting to JB, and the knife that broke in several parts. It seemed to be like a spontaneous PK experience that no one could explain, although it came at the same time, I think, when he was working with the woman who owned the knife in some way.
And I'm pretty sure it's fair to say that JB's research is what inspired Jung to develop his theory of synchronicity.
It could, yes, absolutely could be. He already had that concept, and then, and it, I don't know which came first. Because Jung had been having psychic experiences long before this, and it gave some validity. It helped him, I'm sure, in his communications.
As he became more and more famous, of course, the criticisms mounted, and probably the highlight of the establishment of parapsychology was the book that came out, I think, in 1939, ESP After 60 Years.
That was kind of the summation of, that was kind of, and it is at the end of our book, because it was finally, by that point, they had enough criticisms going on and answer. I mean, years just, and you saw the letters, and you only saw a fraction. There'd be dozens of letters saying the same thing to a different newspaper person or a different professor, because they were saying the same thing and same sort of criticisms. And finally, they organized them all together, and there's some 32 criticisms that they separate specifically in this book. And he worked, it was JB's book, but it was with his team, Greenwood, the mathematician, who lived down the street from us, a personal friend, family friend, and Gaither Pratt. And anyway, the team all worked hard together to put that book together. And it was it wasn't a bestseller, but it was appreciated it was used as a textbook in the textbook realm, or in the research. I'm not saying this right. It was used for students to read in a part of a course in Harvard that first year. And there was a famous psychologist, at least famous to me because I had known his work, Edwin Boring, who had he remained a skeptic, but he was interested, and he invited JB up to his to speak to his students at one point at was it Harvard? I believe, Harvard. Mm-hmm. They courted each other. It never got. They were friendly enough. Boring himself was the one who made the comparison between the similarity between sensory perception and extrasensory perception, which JB had already. He thought that was particularly important because it helped indicate that this was a normal ability, not something neurotic or deranged. Normal people who are taking an ESP test, if they're tired or unhappy, their scores will decline. If they're happy and comfortable, and it goes the other way. And a little alcohol may have an effect one way or the other, depending on how much.
I even recall a study he reported on the effects of Benzedrine on ESP performance.
Right, that lowered it, didn't it? It brought a high score down as you got sleepy and dopey, I think.
That letter got my attention. He said that the Benzedrine increased ESP scores at first, and then they dropped after a while.
So you see, when something like that's happened, if you could believe you were a psychologist that knew enough about it or was an observer, it was real, it's pretty hard to explain how come scores on guessing of something would be affected by that. Now, affecting on learning, yeah, that's what anybody would understand that. But guessing what something's correct, that's got to be extra sensory perception.
I think it's also important to mention that the very term extrasensory perception, or ESP, became a household word because of your father.
Yeah, that's one thing that's still going on, even with all the skeptics that are constantly, even now today. In fact, I think there's a wave going on now so that psychology departments are more critical now. There'll be a group that will finally begin to believe it a little bit, like when that book came out in 1940. But then a new group comes along and it's all the same over again, it seems to be.
In addition to popularizing the phrase extrasensory perception, your father really also changed the name of the discipline. We don't usually use the term psychical research anymore. We use the term parapsychology, and it was because of your father that the language changed.
The language, the methods, the group. Another thing that he did, which I think is of course, an important part of this, is that he worked as a group. No single man, hardly, or two men or two people working together. The Curies did it as a couple, and my father and mother worked as a couple. But behind them and with them is a team to make it work. Somebody you can talk it over with. That's primary. So you can bounce your ideas off of. They don't just come out of the earth.
It's also noteworthy, I think, that throughout his entire career, he always emphasized scientific rigor. That seemed to be the most important concern that he had.
It is, and it was, by and large, the group, kept aware of something. If something cheating was going on, you worked as a team. I worked as a team once with a person from another country, and but the results were checked just as careful as if any of them had done them, and we found I didn't know it. Somebody who was checking it up found out that she was cheating. Broke my heart. My father just handled that very diplomatically and sent her back home. That didn't always happen with of course, the other people working with them were the ones that caught the fraud later. That was very significant because it went much further and much higher up than what I had experienced. So there wasn't much over the years. If somebody was caught cheating, they got rid of them and left. And they were results that the way you do tests are such that you can check on it sooner or later. Now, sometimes it was later if the person in charge was an important person there. And in one case it was true. But, yeah, it's got to be rigor. Otherwise, I mean, the whole thing is, why waste your life on something that's not real? I used to check the data when I was a kid, 15, and I began to check the data, help them check the data when they were a little short-handed. And so I remember how careful we had to be.
But during the early days, the critics assumed that the parapsychologists, if they weren't cheating themselves, that they were being gullible and duped by the research subjects who must have been cheating.
That group of people like Gaither Pratt and so forth have gotten together and no, that they're just you, and that's good when you have a whole team, because you can everybody, the whole group of them could hardly be.
Today, we can say that for better or worse, there are hundreds of individuals doing doctoral level research in parapsychology, a great deal of it in Britain as a result of Robert Morris, who went over to England. And to my knowledge, Morris is one of the people who got trained in parapsychology working in Durham.
Indeed, he did. Yes, he did. Robert Morris was we missed him so much. He was helping us during our difficult times after JB was gone, and then unfortunately he died too young. But he was a marvelous man, and he was a Duke graduate student at the same time I was, a little behind me. And then I think he was in the summer school program. I'm not sure, but he was certainly a helper with the summer school program. Yes, but Europe has now branched out, got its own sources, and it was so. And JB knew most all in his lifetime. He knew nearly all the people that were working overseas. Certainly Hans Bender in Germany, who helped replicate his work here. So much, yeah. He knew them all by name, and if they came to visit here in many cases.
Well, I certainly made a pilgrimage to Durham when I first started out. I met your father. The first thing he wanted to know when he heard I was doing doctoral research in parapsychology was who was supervising me. And when I explained to him I was working under Michael Scriven, who had given the keynote address to the Parapsychological Association, I think in 1961 or 62, he said to me, well, he's a good man.
I do remember him, yes. Well, I did not realize you were working with him, yes.
And also it's worth mentioning that your father was instrumental in founding the Parapsychological Association.
Yeah. He was one that began here at Duke in as late as 67, I think, or maybe 57. 57, I think, yes. And there were several other people, around here or from involved, like close friends, like McConnell from Pittsburgh, and who were involved in that group of them. Yeah, and that was so important. The PA is really doing well now. It's amazing how it's chugged along, and yeah, and we're going to have it's going to be held. Their annual convention is going to be held here in Durham this summer, but it's going to be by Zoom again.
Of course, many people don't know that the Parapsychological Association has formally been affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science since 1969.
So in 69, with the famous anthropologist
Margaret Mead.
Margaret Mead standing up and telling the audience that they should vote for it. It wasn't an easy accomplishment, and it's been tried to take it back, and then the other person that worked, the Douglas Dean, helped to keep that going. Yeah.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Journal of Parapsychology.
Yes, I'm so glad it's the next issue will be coming out in March. We still don't have a permanent editor, but John Kruth is editing that one himself, and it will have the review by Jim Carpenter of our book, which there was the book of letters, and the book review by Jim Carpenter, the author of the inventor of First Sight, and a well-known researcher and clinician of himself, wonderful man, has written a wonderful book review that we hope will help inspire other people who are serious and interested in the history of science and parapsychology to take a look at this book and see if the origins or things or letters which may help inspire them, or I don't know, if nothing else, just help educate young people coming into the field. But you're doing more in the way of education than anyone I know, so I think I'll put a plug in right now. Anybody wants to know what's going on in this field and peripherally, they need to be watching your YouTubes, your field tapes.
Thank you for that, Sally. You yourself were involved, if I recall correctly, after your father left Duke University, he set up the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, but at some point that organization closed down and you helped establish the Rhine Research Center.
Well, I didn't, yes, the staff and I met out at my house. I was the assistant, not the assistant, I was the volunteer director at that point in time, interim between longer until we got John Pruth on board. And the staff brought it up. They said, we don't like it. Actually, John Palmer, to give him credit, he said, I don't like the name because it indicates it's male and not female. The nature of man should be nature of men and women or something. So the group decided that they wanted it to be Rhine Research Center. And I said, no. Neither one of my parents wanted their name involved. They tried very hard to keep out of that. They thought that was not a good thing. But I got outvoted. So it's the Rhine Research Center.
So the work is being carried on even as we speak. The Rhine Research Center, even during the pandemic, they're very active in online courses and training programs and research activities and community activities.
We've never been more popular in terms of, and other people, nonprofits, have heard the same thing. I don't know, it's just parapsychology, but people had a little more time to delve into things, as well as, I suppose, quite a few people lost people and wonder about the survival issue too. But they certainly come to the Zoom classes, the courses, the online courses for credit, and then the evening if you're all interested in research and you're doing it in this field, you can drop in and contribute to the research, a discussion, or there's a dream class, a course. And then people who have we haven't said anything about psychic experiences because that's not paramount in this book, but my mother did that work to start this collection of them. And they are honored and are allowed to be discussed frequently once a month in this group, Psi Experience group that person can find by going onto the website. We'll soon have a jazzier website up. It's on its way to come and have more little pictures and a little more about the history and so forth. But the Rhine Center is an interesting place, and when the doors are open, there will be some things going on inside again. But I hope we never get over some of these Zoom or Skype, in this case, opportunities that allow us to talk to each other. And it's so important, Jeff, and what you're doing. No one else can manage to really get to the heart of things except with a good interview.
Well, and I love doing it, Sally, and it's a pleasure to talk to you, a great pleasure. I think that for young people today who want to get started in parapsychology, the Rhine Research Center is one of the very best resources anywhere in the world. So for viewers out there who are thinking of possibly having a career in parapsychology, there's very few places that I would recommend more than the Rhine Research Center.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That's really important. There are some other, I'm glad there are other, I wish there were more other places studying this. There'll be a group which is focusing on one aspect of parapsychology, and peripheral things like the remote viewers are now coming closer. We shared a conference with them last summer. The Scientific Exploration Society of IONS participates in a lot of things that overlap. And then I'm fond of the one that I think Garrett started because I'm very fond of Lizette Coley, and who runs the Parapsychology Foundation. And I may be missing some other major ones only in this country. Gosh, if you could go on all night if you went around the world.
Well, Sally, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you once again. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for being so patient with my technology issues.
It's, I'm sure, a real thrill for our viewers to be able to have this experience of you, because you can't travel everywhere, but this image will go all over the world.
Well, I'm glad of that. And if people have experiences, psychic experiences, they can mail them to the Rhine Center. We're still collecting them, And I think there'll be some research going now, beginning more into that, picking up where my mother left off, and I tried to do that. So that's another thing too. You can start with experiences and then do a little education along the side. And thank you, Jeff. Keep it up, and we'll keep watching you and listening to you.
For those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.